Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Lit Talk. I am Jotham Borello. I am the director of the Connecticut Literary Festival. We are housed at Central Connecticut State University in the English department, and we are generously supported by the CT Humanities. We love the people at CT Humanities and the Center for the Book run by Lisa Comstock. Tonight is a panel we've been discussing and backstage in our office for a long time, The Lives of Others, a discussion of biography with Robert Dowling and Shanna Benjamin, and it'll be hosted by Ethan Rutherford in just a second. I want to tell you a little more about our program, and we've been doing Lit Talks, like everyone, COVID forced us online. We've been doing a whole bunch of these. They're all archived on our website if you'd like to see some of our previous discussions. In our spring season, we have one left. It'll be in a few weeks. I believe it's on April 13th. The other upcoming program that's pretty exciting, we've been working on a long time. So the festival really does three things. We publish an anthology occasionally. We have our on-ground festival in October, and then we do the Lit Talks. And this year we are collaborating with the CT Poet Laureate Margaret Gibson to celebrate Earth Day on October 22nd at Real Artways, another one of our sponsors in Hartford. This is going to be a mini festival, Poets for a Greener World. There's going to be a food truck, there's going to be a bookstore, and there is a whole bunch of programming, including a film screening. And that's all at Real Artways. So look at our website. We're looking for volunteers for the day if anyone would like to participate, but please come out. It is free and open to the public. You do need to be vaccinated, and we were going to recommend masks, but like everything else in COVID, that can change in a heartbeat. And tonight, this program is curated by the Literary Festival. Our program coordinator is Anna Cristiano, and Julia and Victoria does our marketing. So thank you to our staff. They've done a hell of a job. So I'm going to welcome up to the screen here our host for the evening, Ethan Rutherford. His fiction has appeared in many journals, including Tin House and Electric Literature, Plowshares, and others. His first book received an honorable mention for the PEN/Hemingway Award and was a Barnes & Noble Discover of Great Writers book. His second collection, Further South, was published by A Strange Object in May of last year, and he teaches creative writing at Trinity College. Ethan, come on up here, sir. And he lives in Connecticut, our great state. So it's great to have you, Ethan. Thank you for hosting us this evening. If we can unmute you, can you hear me?
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, there we go.
You have to unmute yourself there.
Yeah, there we go. We're going.
You too.
Well,
there's always going to be
you've been reading these books, I know, and you're ready to go. And I think last time, Ethan, you did And to Be Gauge, you did an interview for us at the festival live. So now we get you virtual, and we'll see the difference there. But thanks a lot for joining us. The last thing for everyone watching, down at the bottom, you see Ask a Question. If you hit Ask a Question, you get to type a question. And Ethan will keep his eye on that. If someone asks a question that's better than yours, you can vote it to the top, just like on a game show, which is pretty groovy. Don't expect our guests who are going to be chatting and talking to kind of follow the chat. They may, but we do ask that you use a question after the bottom of the hour or so, but Ethan will kind of get to the questions. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys. Have a lot of fun. Thanks a lot for participating.
Thank you, Jonathan.
All right. Thank you. Wonderful to see you guys. Thank you, everybody, for coming. As Jotham said, my name is Ethan Rutherford. I teach creative writing at Trinity College. And it's just such a pleasure to be here in the Zoom room of the mind with Shanna Greene Benjamin and Robert Dowling, and to welcome you guys as well. So Shanna and Rob are writers and scholars of the highest caliber, and they've each written wonderful and immersive biographies that kept me company recently as I traveled across the country to tend to ailing parents. Life, as always, intrudes, which is, I'm sure, something we'll be talking about today. I mention this only because as I read both books at 30,000 feet in a cramped seat in a dark cabin with only the small dome light on the page, I began to experience the strange feeling of closeness one sometimes has with a stranger while traveling. Someone sits down next to you and they tell you their life story. And somehow you're plunged into an intimacy that you don't even always achieve, not even with long relations. So it was a wonderful and disorienting experience. And it left me not only with a new grasp of the lives led and the work done by these two incredible figures, the scholar Nellie McKay, right here, and the playwright Eugene O'Neill, get these books, we'll make sure that those links go up. They're wonderful books. But it also left me with an appreciation for the task that these authors who are with us tonight undertook. It's no surprise that these books are interesting and readable, and they make their cases plainly for the importance of their subjects. They are models of attention, research, and obsession, the healthy kind, and engagement. But it struck me as I read through them just what a monumental authorial task it is to pull off the work of biography. The research, the phone calls, the textual expertise, and the long hours at the desk. And then the imagination and the skill and the craft that it takes to shape these lives compellingly on the page. It's no easy task to imagine and render the lives of others like this, and they've done it. And so after they speak a little bit about their work, I will ask them how they managed to do it so successfully. So I'm going to introduce both of them now, and then they will introduce you to Nellie McKay and to Eugene O'Neill and to their books. And then we will gather for a conversation about the experience and process of writing these lives on the page. We may be in for, I was on a bumpy ride out to see my parents. We might be in for a little bit of a bumpy ride on the technical side of things. We're going to try to do a screen share. So bear with us through some of the technical stuff. If it glitches, we'll be back and we'll talk our way through it. But with luck, it will all go well. So as Jotham said, you can ask a question as well, and we'll be sure to get to them if we can. You just put it down there, and I will find it, and I will elevate it if it's better than my questions. It is like a game show. I have hundreds of questions because these are such wonderful books. So here we go. So I'm going to introduce these guys, and then Shanna will read, or will discuss her project first. So Shanna Greene Benjamin is a biographer and a scholar who studies the literature, lives, and archives of Black women. She has published on African American literature and Black women's intellectual history in African American Review and PMLA studies in American fiction. She's a coach who helps graduate students and faculty members write only what they can, which is a formulation I love. It's not just write what you can, it's write what only you can. She's a consultant who helps colleges and universities engage with inclusivity as a practice. This is her book. It's wonderful. It's called Half in Shadow. I'm not doing that very well, am I? And it's backwards, perhaps. But it's a wonderful book, and you should get it. Robert Dowling is a professor of English at Central Connecticut State University. His biography, Eugene O'Neill, A Life in 4 Acts, was named a Los Angeles Times Book Prize finalist for biography in 2015. His co-edited book, Conversations with Sam Shepard, was just released in 2021. And he's working on a biography of the recently departed playwright Sam Shepard with the working title, A Place and Time, The Life and Work of Sam Shepard. So first up, we'll talk to Shanna and then Robert. So please help me welcome Shanna Greene Benjamin.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Ethan. That was just fantastic. I was transported to the flight and the plane with you. I took my first flight probably beginning of March, first flight in 2 years. So I know what you mean about the light and about just the aloneness, but also being with other people. So thank you for that introduction. I want to also thank Anna and all of the staff who work behind the scenes, Jotham, to make sure that this was able to be pulled off virtually. I was reading about the way that this has functioned in person, and I'm sorry I can't be with everyone, that we can't be together, but I'm delighted that we have the opportunity to come together and create this kind of virtual community. So I will go ahead and get started. I'm going to share this this screen. I think it will work. Unless Ethan tells me otherwise, I will presume that I am up and running, that everything looks okay. And then I will just toggle from here through my slides. Okay, so I've titled my remarks, let me go ahead and get my timer started to make sure that I don't dawdle. So I've titled my remarks Into the Light, Half in Shadow in the Craft of Black Feminist Biography. And it was really important for me to frame this in terms of Black feminist biography, because I think that in terms of craft, researching and documenting the lives of Black women, individuals who have been traditionally marginalized, who are spoken of, but not really investigated in terms of their interior. That's happened more, of course, over time since Black women scholars have integrated predominantly white institutions and have done a lot of the research on establishing traditions of Black feminist thought. But I just wanted to make sure that that was central, because I'd love for us to be able to return to that later. So my slides are going to proceed. We're going to begin by talking about why Nellie, why McKay. I think identifying a subject of for biography is, there are lots of pathways to identifying a subject. And we can also talk about what makes a worthy and deserving subject, and some of the work that I did in the earlier stages to justify and to really claim the value of McKay's life and writing to be documented in long form biography this way. I'll talk a little bit about Out of the Shadows, traditions of Black feminist biography, and how some of those traditions informed my thinking about Half in Shadow, and then Into the Light, Black women in the academy. And so that will be primarily about how McKay's story resonated with my life and my experience, and the way that I see her narrative holding and having value even today. So, why Nellie, why McKay? So, McKay was, she earned her BA in English from Queens College at a time of a lot of, it was this intense political action. You had, protests about the Vietnam War, Black studies, you had riots, you had building takeovers. And when she went to Queens College, she went there primarily during night school. She was, what we find out later, she was a working mother, and she fit in higher education the only way that she could. She ended up at Harvard University with a PhD, studying English in their PhD program, and graduated from Harvard in 1977, and then worked at the University of Wisconsin-Madison for the length of her career. And that was from 1978 through 2006, which was the year that she passed. And when I first decided that I wanted to research her life, it was in part because of the way that she had impacted the field. So McKay's intellectual project can be summarized this way. So she was at the forefront of the canonization of African-American literature. She co-edited the Norton Anthology of African-American literature alongside Henry Louis Gates Jr. She also saw to it that Black women were represented on the editorial board there. She also initiated the integration of African-American literature into English departments. At the time, Black literature was only taught through and in Black studies programs. And she thought that in order to teach American literature, African-American literature had to be woven into it. It had to be front and center. She was one of the scholars who helped to develop the field that we now know as Black feminist thought. And she and other literary scholars, among them Alice Walker, Beverly Guy Sheftall, who did a lot of the early theorizing in their analyses of Black women in the novels of Black women writers, began to think about what it means to center the lives and the experiences of Black women as fully formed human subjects. And then, of course, the creation of PhD pipelines for scholars of African-American literature, especially Black scholars. So I met McKay when I was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, when I was there in graduate school. So I had started at Johnson C. Smith University, which is a historically Black college here in Charlotte, North Carolina. And then I entered the MA program in Afro-American Studies and then did the PhD in English. And McKay was my dissertation advisor. And so, you know, during the length of time that we worked together, we had the kind of standard student professor relationship, but I think that it was particularly close because of the way that she helped me to navigate the politics of what it meant to be a Black woman at a really pretty canonical and traditional English, within a traditional and canonical English department. Now, when she passed in 2006, there were all of these stories that came to light. We realized that there was so much that she kept to herself. Not only was she 10 years older than we knew, but she had also withheld information about her two children, the fact that she was a mother. She introduced to her colleagues her daughter as her sister. They didn't know that she had a son. They didn't know that she was about 10 years older than they thought she was, that she had been married and divorced. And so it was these kinds of withholdings that really made me wonder why, and set me on the path to investigate her life. So there are lots of ways that Black feminist biography informed this research. And so I'll talk here a little bit about the politics of naming, triangulated constructs, and autobiography in part. So the politics of naming, Shireen Sherrard Johnson talks a little bit in her introduction in the early part of Dorothy West Paradise about what she's going to call West during the length of the narrative. And this may seem to be kind of small potatoes, but really when we're talking about how we establish the authority of Black women, it's really important to think about the politics of naming. And so this was something that I really took to heart when I was writing McKay's life story and deciding to call her McKay and not call her Nellie unless someone else was doing so. This idea of triangulation was something that Alexis DeVoe talked about in Warrior Poet, because it was there that she explained that there were these multiple truths. And even if we never arrive at any one singular truth, if we kind of triangulate these narratives, we can get at the different perspectives and allow the complexities to coexist. So that was a methodology that I actively applied in my research and writing on McKay. And then, of course, was Amani Perry's biography, Looking for Lorraine. And she talks about how biography is autobiography, at least in part. And so I decided to include vignettes or scenes, kind of memoir, first person narration to serve as counterpoint to my chapters on McKay. So it's a non-traditional biography, but I think that it's fully couched in traditions of Black feminist thought because of the way that I deploy the notion that the personal is political. So this is just a little bit of, you know, the repositories I had to visit, and we can talk later about what it means to build an archive. I know archivists don't like the use of archive beside, you know, other than the bricks and mortar, but I think about it in terms of the resources that I have at my disposal in order to write this story. But I think that for women traditionally marginalized, how we go about establishing or generating the primary source material that's going to be foundational, you have to be creative and thoughtful. And we talked a little earlier, Rob and I were talking a little bit earlier about the snowball method in terms of interviewing, especially when your subject has a lot of contemporaries who are still living. So this was a piece that I wrote on Black women and the biographical method and what it means to write about subjects who are prone to secrecy. So I also see this work intersecting with my teaching and with pedagogy because students played an active role in this project. I feel like, did I miss something? No, I didn't. Okay. I just had that. So I was summing up before I even realized it. So some of the takeaways, you know, this project impacts what we know about Black women in the academy, Black feminist autobiography, the politics of the archive, and Black literary history. It also impacts how we teach in taking an engaged approach to undergraduate research, inclusive pedagogies, and then mentoring and demystifying the college experience, because McKay was also known as a premier mentor who established pipelines and used her authority in order to get her students in positions where they could elevate and move forward their careers. So a few words on Black women in the academy before I turn it over. And so McKay felt this urgency to accomplish all she could. And she was really intent on making sure that she was maintaining and leaving for us something that was really useful, something that was really important. And one of the things that's really important, I think, to imagine when we consider the importance of Black women in the academy is the way that McKay's presence and the presence of her contemporaries impacted not just disciplines, but also institutions. And then finally, they had a pedagogical impact, which I'm very happy again to return to. So I will sum it up here and want to thank all of you for your attention. And I certainly look forward to the Q&A and my discussion with Rob.
Well, that was just fantastic and tough act to follow. But I have to say, you know, I really want to thank Ethan and Anna, and especially Jotham, who puts the whole thing together, just like Shanna did. It's just a fabulous creation that you guys have come up with. Ethan, did you get that photograph of mine? So I'm just, for everybody involved, I'm really tech terrible. And so I didn't even try. I mean, I did try, but it didn't work naturally.
I'm looking for it, and if I get it, I'll throw it up there.
Julia. Okay.
So yeah. So go ahead, Robert. And if I can get it up there, I will.
Sure. Okay. So Eugene O'Neill was born on October 16th, 1888. How boring is that to start out a talk like that? What's cool is that he was born at the Barrett House, which was a residential hotel at 43rd Street and Broadway. So he was actually born in the middle of Times Square, in the middle of what we now consider Broadway, before Broadway existed. This is what, you know, I had the, great honor of having my biography translated into Chinese. And so I've spent some time in China giving talks about O'Neill. And my translator and I had a long drive between the Dead Sea of China and the Yellow River. It was like an 8-hour drive. And there's this Chinese expression called yuan fan, which has no English translation. So we were just, biding our time and figured out a translation that worked for both of us. And it's basically a random happenstance with cosmic implications for the future. So here's this boy that was born at 43rd Street and Broadway. He was an 11-pound child. And any mothers out there know that that's a big deal. And his mother was quite slight. And so his birth initiated a morphine addiction that lasted for over 25 years with his mother, because his father was a very famous actor, and I'll get to that in a second. But doctors at the time were really afraid of these kind of well-heeled women. And so the first thing they wanted to do was to stop their pain before anything else. And regardless of the circumstances. And so he put her on morphine, and sure enough, she became a morphine addict for 25 years. Now that actually, over 25 years. Now that actually was very common among wealthy women at the time, for all the same reasons. I actually talked to the opioid specialist in America at the University of North Carolina, and he said there's only one insider account. I was dramaturging for Jessica Lange when she was doing Long Day's Journey into Night on Broadway, which is about O'Neill's mother's addiction. And she asked me, well, what's it like to be, a wealthy woman and a morphine addict? And I couldn't, I did all this research, couldn't find any insider accounts, any reportage about it, or, memoirs or anything. And so I finally got this guy from UNC, and he said, yeah, there aren't any, because basically it was just considered such a shame to the family that the women would just withhold. So there's that. So Long Day's Journey into Night, for those of you who are familiar with it, each individual has a lot of blame to go around. His mother is a morphine addict. His father is an alcoholic who's too cheap with his money. His brother is an alcoholic who is brilliant but refuses to work. But O'Neill's character is basically blamed for having been born at all and having created this whole mess, which, of course, is, that's one of the big questions that I get into in the biography. So he's born on Broadway. His father was one of the most famous actors in America, most definitely. He was a huge deal, James O'Neill. And his father bought the rights to a version of the Count of Monte Cristo, Dumas' The Count of Monte Cristo, called Monte Cristo, for about $5,000, and he made a fortune on it. And he played Monte Cristo over and over and over again. It's a horrible play. Don't read it. Basically, everybody who went to see it to see James O'Neill, because that's what the system was back then. It was a star vehicle system. It wasn't about the plays. So playwrights were sort of like, screenwriters in the studio system, kind of, skilled hacks. Basically, same thing now, unless you're, Aaron Sorkin or something. And so he made this enormous amount of money. But he had been, as a young man, this incredible Shakespearean actor. And he played in Othello with Edwin Booth, who's basically considered the great, probably the greatest Shakespearean American actor there's ever been. I mean, I'm not sure anybody can compare. And Edwin Booth, they would switch parts in Othello. Booth would play Othello, and then James O'Neill would play Iago, and then vice versa. And offstage, Booth wrote Booth told the manager that he plays Othello better than I ever have. And so the manager wrote it down on a piece of paper, gave it to James O'Neill, and James O'Neill had it in his wallet for the rest of his life. But he bought this play, made a lot of money. It's because he was born in poverty. I mean, that's a long story. He was an Irish immigrant, and started working when he was 10 years old. And so money and land meant everything to him. But O'Neill and he, right when he was dying of stomach cancer, he and O'Neill had a long conversation that's included in Long Day's Journey into Night, although it takes place in 1912. He dies in 1920. And his father just said, sort of, what was it I wanted to buy that I would give up my birthright as this great Shakespearean actor? And O'Neill just decided right then and there that he would never sell out. And he never did. I adore Tennessee Williams, but I mean, for example, Tennessee Williams would change endings of his plays for, Elia Kazan and various reasons. O'Neill never did. And, it was controversial at times. We could talk about that. There was one time in Michigan, anyway, that they were furious that he had in Moon for the Misbegotten, that he had used the words whore and mother in the same sentence, and so he was just like, all right, fine. But the rest of the time, nope, could not change a thing. So he wrote a play about his experience growing up in this family called Long Day's Journey into Night, which I'm sure many of you have read. And if you haven't, you should definitely check it out. It's very readable. He was a frustrated novelist. So he never meant it to be published as a play. He produced as a play. Never produced as a play, never produced as a film, never put on television, which had just come up in the late 40s when he wrote this, mandate. But that it could be published as a book 25 years after his death. So he died in 1953, and his third wife, Carlotta Monterey, who's probably the hardest part of writing my biography, interestingly, because she's such a giant personality that she almost took over from O'Neill, but she's not a very appealing personality. She's there's a lot to say there, but I mean, she's racist, anti-Semitic, and a very cold person. But this kind of giant personality, whereas O'Neill was kind of reticent and quiet. Anyway, she lied and said that O'Neill had said on his deathbed that he wanted the Royal Theatre of Sweden to produce his play Long Day's Journey into Night in Swedish, which was, we've got overwhelming evidence that that's not true. And excuse me. And but she had full control. She was the executor, and she had full control, executrix, as they said back then. And so they did it. Now, and then they produced it in New Haven first, actually, which not many people know, and then New York. And it was such a sensation. On opening night, this is with Jason Robards and all these wonderful actors, on opening night, the stage was rushed by the audience members. 1956 this was. And of course the actors were just exhausted. And I've met actors after Long Day's Journey into Night many times, and they are exhausted. It's just emotionally exhausting. And a British critic said that the tallest skyscraper in New York is the reputation of Eugene O'Neill. And he had been lost. His reputation had been lost for about 20 years. And suddenly he was back. And then there was what we call the Eugene O'Neill Renaissance, where Long Day's Journey into Night, Moon for the Misbegotten, The Iceman Cometh, Huey, Touch of the Poet, all these fabulous productions, revivals, first productions, revivals came out And so his reputation sort of blossomed at that point. And it was a tragic end because he died of a very rare neurological illness. And but his mind was perfectly fine, but his body wasn't. So, and he had all these plays in mind, but he couldn't do it. He couldn't write them down. He couldn't record them. So it was a tragic ending, but a great sort of uplifting finale after his passing. And I guess I'll just stop by saying that, after I wrote this book, I just thought, man, there is no way I'm going to get a better story than this. But Sam Shepard's pretty damn close. That's it. Hopefully it wasn't too long. I think it might have been. Should have been checking my watch.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
That was great. I mean, thank you. And I also love the teaser trailer at the end. Be like, stay tuned for Sam Shepard at the
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys, both of you. And I have so many questions. I imagine that other folks will as well, and that you guys could probably sort of carry the conversation completely on your own. But one of the things that I want to turn the focus to you guys. You've done such an amazing job in these books of explaining to, making the case that these are incredibly important sort of figures historically and for all sorts of things, field formation, American drama, and all of that. But Shanna, you said this really wonderful thing when I was reading your book, where you sort of talk about some projects you choose. This project chose me. And as I was going through both these books, it occurred to me, like I'm a fiction writer, I just make stuff up. And if I don't, I can just make it up, right? But both of these projects, there's a huge amount of time and energy goes into sort of compiling sources and getting the stories and worrying about sort of getting it right. And I was wondering if you guys could briefly speak a little bit, perhaps to what you meant about your personal relationship to this particular project, and perhaps how it changed over the duration of the project. And give us, those of us who are tuning in, maybe a sense of the scale of the work. How long did it take you to compile all this work? And then after we sort of talk about that, where I do want to move it is like what I became fascinated, particularly in Nellie McKay's case, where what do you do when the subject that you are researching is in some ways has already crafted a narrative about their life, that in the process of your research, you start to kind of pick apart and notice that there are sort of holes. And I think that, Shanna, you were talking about this with the idea of triangulating your sort of research to actually get at the parts of the story that perhaps don't want to be told, talking about the snowball method and stuff, in the sense of maybe creating like mosaic rather than an all-encompassing thing. I thought that was so interesting. So I wondered if you could just start perhaps by giving us a sense of what about this project chose you specifically and then kept you at it, even in those dark nights of the soul. And then how you rose up to sort of meet the challenges of telling this story, particularly with somebody who perhaps was a little bit reticent.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for that. So in that moment, when I wrote that at the beginning of Half in Shadow, and it was a project that took me 10 years to complete. And that was from, me just really sitting around with some of my colleagues when McKay passed. And Gene Jarrett, we were having lunch after one of his visits, and he said, "You should write about this." And he laid out for me, probably clearer than I could have seen it myself, the ways that I had life experiences that made me sensitive to particular, the nuance in different contexts of her life. So even though I'm not an immigrant, she was, and came from a family of strivers. She had a deep connection with her church family. And that's not something that any of us really knew. We would not have painted her in that way. And I think that in the beginning stages, there was a lot that I wanted to know. I wanted to know why, but why answered itself pretty quickly. Like once I figured out that this was a Black woman, a daughter of immigrants who was attempting to, break into higher education at Harvard, no less, it became very clear to me why she would have withheld, given stereotypes, given the Moynihan report. I mean, there's just a lot going on at the moment where basically politically and socially, all of the ills of Black life are placed at the feet of striving Black women. And so she wasn't going to sort of go in for that. So she was withholding what she could because she couldn't control how people saw her as a Black woman. That's how she showed up in the room. And so there was something about this that just really wouldn't let go. It was an idea, and then I started and I told people. And then once I told people, then, folks would ask, how's it going? And then when it wasn't going well, I felt awful. But I had this incredible community of peers, of scholars at Grinnell who were so, they knew that it had to be done. And they knew that I could do it, even when I doubted myself. And so I think that once I learned more about her life, the reason I couldn't let go was because it became clear, and I didn't know this at the outset, that she had this vision of a world for me that I walked into, that I didn't ask for, but that she made happen. She and other scholars really Black women scholars literally gave their lives so that I could have a place in higher education as a professor, as a scholar, as a teacher, as a mentor, at a time when they were being questioned at every turn. Now, there are lots of things about her experience that translate even today that, part of what I wanted to show was the issues remain. So when I have these scenes and I juxtapose my life story with hers, it's to say, you think that her story was then, her story is now. And so that was the connection, this sort of heartstring. And the fact that I felt like it was a commitment to her and to a generation of Black women who I think are worthy of taking up space on these shelves, having biographies, having someone really carefully and thoughtfully pore over their papers, mine the archives, and just read for what resonates and for the threads that emerge that I think I can write to that someone else might not. And so, one of the things that I learned is that I can only write the story that I can. And that maybe if someone comes back to McKay, they'll take it from another point of view. But I can't write all of the stories. I just have to write this one. And once that became clear, then it was I say much easier, but it was not easy, but it was easier to start getting words on the page and move closer to completion.
Yeah, I think the book does that beautifully. It really comes across. The juxtaposition is really wonderful, and it does exactly, at least for my experience reading it, what you've described. It's just bringing all of this up to be seen. This is sort of a little bit of a question about the research component. Earlier, you guys were talking about the snowball part of research.
That's what I'd like to hear more about that with her, because I'm experiencing it myself. But if Shanna could start, I can, add.
Yes, and I'm a little bit unfamiliar with it, but I would love to hear you sort of talk about that.
You're not sure what we were talking about. Yeah.
Well, it's this idea, there are folks who write biographies and everyone associated with their subject is dead. So
Right.
you have letters, you have different types of ephemera that might be held in archives, papers. If someone has papers in an attic, you catch wind of someone who might have corresponded with your subject but never turned anything over, then trying to, have those, initiate those relationships. But the snowball effect is really, the snowball method is really about, you interview someone and then you say, well, who else should I talk to? And so for every one person, you get 3 or 4 more people. And then you find yourself, you're talking that you want to be thorough. So of course you go through with the interviews, but then at some point you realize, okay, these folks kind of fit into categories, and I may not have all of the details from this particular person, but if I want to capture, say, McKay's life in Boston when she was there as a graduate student, I have enough folks who are within that circle to make sure that I represent, that moment. Now, of course, once the book is out, then people contact you and they say, this person was there and this was going on and you missed this, and but I think committing yourself to capturing the spirit of the thing is absolutely necessary, because there's no way, it's not a documentary. You have to pick and choose and have representative examples and voices to carry the narrative along.
Yeah, it's almost like abstract math. At some point you hit a spot and then suddenly it bursts out, and then it bursts out more, and then it's so tough because when I wrote the O'Neill biography, I hunted down exactly 2 people who were alive and met him. And one met him when he was 9 years old. The kid was 9 years old, and O'Neill was elderly, basically. And that was the son of an illustrator of his. And, and that was great. And he was 96 when I interviewed him, and then, or 92 or something. And then luckily, unbelievably, his personal nurse, when he wrote Long Day's Journey into Night, Morning Comes, or Moon for the Misbegotten, Huey, Touch of the Poet, Iceman Cometh, she was in the next room over to take care of his every need while he was writing all of his great final works. And she was 101. And I called her and I said, listen, do you know why Carlotta allowed, the production for Long Day's Journey into Night? And she said, yeah, of course I do. And I said, well, do you want to tell me? And she said, you come on out here, honey, and I'll tell you all about it. So I had to get a grant to fly out to, Danville, California. And it was 100% worth it. I had this wonderful 4-hour interview with her. But those were the 2 people. With Sam Shepard, like with Nellie McKay, most of them are still around, And every time, I just got a email from from a lighting designer of his, who will remain nameless, but she said, okay, so we've got this person, this person, this person. And, we had a wonderful time. I just did a research trip in LA and interviewed a bunch of people. But just like Shanna was saying, you meet one person, they say, well, and I'm sure this is true for Shanna. For me, as an African-American woman academic, people are probably delighted. For me, I'm kind of an outsider. They don't quite know me. Maybe, I don't know. Who knows?
Actually, not exactly.
Huh?
Because, I'm her student, and I'm seeking private information about a woman who did not decide to tell me these details. That, getting access took some doing. And I needed to have, when I contacted her daughter sent this email to Nell Painter, Thaddeus Davis, Susan Friedman. I think Stanley James might have been on that email thread. But basically asking, should I help her? And there's this whole back and forth about yes, but she should wait. You know, Professor Davis had done the Nella Larson biography, and she said she should wait until after tenure to do the biography because it takes so long, all these other things. And then there were folks, McKay's peers, someone I had contacted who did not respond to my calls, and someone who I had interviewed served as an intermediary and spoke with her and said, it wasn't so bad. I read her proposal. She knows what she's doing.
Right,
and I
exactly.
mean, you know,
you have to prove yourself one way or the other.
You have to prove yourself, and they have to trust you with the confidences that they decided to keep, whether McKay asked them explicitly or not. If she's gone and she can't give permission, then they think very, very carefully about who they give that access to.
Right. Exactly. There are plenty of African-American women academics who could do the same thing. Who's, who are they going to give this information to? Or, I mean, it's funny because, well, anyway, what were you going to say?
Oh, no. I mean, I think that was one of the great, as a reader, that was one of the things that made me understand the degree to which, how difficult of a job it is to put these book projects together. And I would love to hear you sort of like, in some ways, kind of unpack how you kind of mobilized all this information. And then, because to me, some of these books were also someone in particular, sort of the Nellie case, the story of, this is the story that I'm sort of finding, and then this is the story that I feel like I need to tell. And in some ways, therefore, it's also like a wonderful kind of autobiography in a positioning in that way. And I think that book is, in particular, does an incredible job. There's a wonderful O'Neill quote. And I actually had a question about how you guys contend with this sense of the role of the biographer in these particular situations, right? I'm a fiction writer. I could just be like, no, my parents are always like, why are the parents' characters always so mean? I'm like, it's fiction, It's very easy, right? And so O'Neill, there's this wonderful O'Neill quote where he goes, "Call me a tragic optimist. I believe everything I doubt and doubt everything I believe. And no motto strikes me as a better one than the ancient hew to the line and let the chips fall where they may." And as I was reading that, I was like, oh, that sounds to me like the project of the biographer, but it gets very complicated. And I would love to hear perhaps you sort of talk about maybe those moments where you kind of discovered this is the story that only I can tell. And I think the book does a great job of saying this isn't definitive, but this is the version of the story that I can tell, and how you sort of came to that decision and kind of perhaps came against those forces that were like, well, maybe you're not sort of the right person. You're like, well, I am. And I think that probably happened in the O'Neill book too, because one of the things that the challenges of the O'Neill book is that so much has been written about O'Neill that in some ways you go, what is the way that I am? So what's my version of this particular story?
It's an industry. Yeah.
So it's like you have similar challenges, but in kind of on opposite sides. So I wonder if you could sort of maybe speak to that. Like, were there moments where you said, we're going to hew to the line. I found the line and I'm going to let the chips fall where they may.
Shanna, do you want to?
Sure. So I realized that I started and stopped this thing, I don't know how many times. I have so many versions of a beginning, and I couldn't get going. And I had a conversation with my colleague, Carla Erickson at Davidson, not Davidson, Grinnell. And Carla said, you need to visualize who you're writing to. Well, who are you writing to? Because you have to think about voice and pitch and what you include and what you exclude. And, who is that person who is sitting with the book, reading it? And then once I was able to do that, and I envisioned, a young Black woman in the professoriate, there was, and I write about this in this interview, actually, Ashanti Reese, there was someone very particular. I ran into her at an event and I thought, this is the person. This is the person. And so I would write. I realized that I was writing to her, but that I also had to tell myself the story first. And so going back through and figuring out all of the layers in that through line that you're talking about, I had to get the whole story out in front of me and then really step back and, workshop it, get feedback about what was resonating, what did I have evidence to substantiate, what was interesting, but there wasn't really enough. I couldn't get a particular, something corroborated, what I had to leave out. And eventually, and really, when I was doing the index, it struck me that this was a book about Black women in the academy. And it had been, kind of hovering there.
Right.
But when I was thinking about keywords, I'm like, wait a minute, these are missing. I have to make sure that this is there so that when people pick up the book, they know that this is an entry point.
Fabulous. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, with O'Neill, it's, I was very interested in unknown, well, not necessarily unknown, but writers about New York City. And, but I treated the unknown writers equally with Henry James and Walt Whitman, like Hutchins Hapgood and, Helen Campbell and these people who were writing about New York at the same time. And I just treated them as if there was no difference. It wasn't, oh, here's the great Walt Whitman saying this. They were always mixed. And I love that democratic element. And I stick by it. And O'Neill was very much that way. I don't know if I brought this up, but he, talks about farmers. He talks about prostitutes. He talks about cocaine addicts and morphine addicts and, drunks and, and tortured African Americans. And just every imaginable social matrix in America he brings into play, all on the same level. Whereas most of those sailors and so forth, most of those people were stereotyped before him. It was all stereotypes on the stage and everybody could laugh at them. Well, he made them sympathetic and real. And that was his form of propaganda. He was totally against political propaganda. But that was his form of propaganda, was to just simply let these people speak for themselves, and just not impose anything upon them as best he could. But yeah, so I guess after writing so much about kind of unknown writers and along with the big ones, I thought, I really wanted to challenge myself with one of the big guns, and Eugene O'Neill was clear. We both grew up we were both born in New York, raised in Connecticut as children, went back to New York. We've got, both Irish Catholic and, have very similar sensibilities and political views. And it was just an obvious choice. And I adore the man. I know him fully. And I feel like he's a member of my family with all his warts and all. And, but that's kind of one of the things about Sam Shepard that I'm, interested in, is that it's some things, in common with him. And I've shared experiences that he's experienced, but he's a different creature altogether. And so it's a challenge for me, you know.
This is so wonderful, and actually that is going to thread into sort of my we've somehow run out of time. I mean, we're just getting started, but it threads into my last.
That's
question,
my fault. I'm sure. I'm sorry.
No. It's just these hours. They go by so fast when there's so much to talk about, and it's so wonderful. And these are great books. I'll send you all the rest of my questions. But
okay, good.
I wanted to sort of end on a little bit of a dreamy question, if that's okay. And it has to do a little bit with what both you guys are talking about. That has to do sort of with like what I would call maybe like the loneliness and the comfort of the biographer, and that you have these people with you. And it's such a long, long journey to write these books and to gather all this information. But you do have somebody keeping you company. It's the person that you're writing about. And it was clear it's a form of love that you guys have for these people. And that came across really wonderfully. And I was wondering, fiction writers talk about how if you spend enough time with the characters that you've made up, eventually they start talking to you and kind of tell you where it is they need you or the story to go. And I was just wondering if that is the case with you guys as practicing sort of biographers, literary biographers, was there ever a point in your work where you sort of hit a spot and you said, I'm not entirely sure what I need to do here. And then you either turn to the work of Nellie McKay or Eugene O'Neill, and that said, actually, here's the way forward. That, in other words, they helped the progress along as well.
Go for it, Shanna.
Well, so in an early version of the manuscript, I opened with a letter to McKay. It didn't work, but I knew that I was trying to talk to her. And I was trying to figure out, you get your reader reports back, and, readers can have different responses. It's like, well, you say you're writing a biography, but this is a memoir. So either do the memoir or do the biography, but trying to figure out how this hybrid was going to work took some doing. And I knew it when I thought about the fact that I was revealing information about her. And I thought that in these vignettes or scenes that I needed to experience that if I was going to be responsible for these details of her life that she did not share, that I had to share something, that I had to be in that space of vulnerability and talk about what it feels like to be exposed, or to, not talk about what it feels like to be exposed, but to be exposed. And I think there were moments when I would write and I would just kind of zone out and then it would just all kind of land on the page. And it usually wasn't the final, it was never the final copy, but there was a nugget in there, something that was just perfect. And I don't account for that, but I do feel like you get to a point where you're committed to the topic, the person, the idea, the story, the memory, and then how your body just kind of filters all of that information, and then out come these words. I think that's that's the experience that I had, particularly while writing those scenes.
No, that's lovely. And I really like that, where it's like, if this is going to be about me, it's also going to be about you, and sort of made the book what it is and what makes it so unique. I think that's great. Rob, do you want to have sort of speak to that, and then
yeah.
we are gonna. I'm getting the shepherd's hook. I've got the
getting the shepherd's hook, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I'll just say that for the most part, I try to, and this is, Shanna and I are a little bit different in this way, and that's fine. I love both kinds of biographies, but I'm a little bit more distant. I try to just tell the narrative, almost like a photographer or something. I mean, photographers obviously have bias too, and I do too, and there's always decision-making process. But I never criticize any of his plays, never once. Once in a footnote, I made a snide remark, but because the point is that for me, it's not about me. It's not about my perspective on this play, because God knows what fabulous director could do something wonderful with a play that everybody else thinks is terrible. And, so I don't want to turn anybody off of Eugene O'Neill in any way, but I did use a lot of reception history. So the critics at the time sort of spoke for me. And so I left out the 21st century and just entirely focused on the moment. So virtually anything in the book is taken from primary sources of the moment, and from the people who are actually the subjects, rather than anybody commenting on them. And now it's a lot easier to do with Eugene O'Neill, because like we were saying, I mean, there's a whole industry of him, but if you just zero in on the primary sources, make sure you corroborate, and just let the narrative take itself over.
Okay. All right. On those words of wisdom, I think, and I hope, Shanna, thank you guys so much. This was really wonderful. I love talking to you. I hope you get a chance to read the comments before we sort of click out. Everyone's like, you guys are amazing, which is true. And for those of you who are watching, please read these books. They're really incredible, and go grab them. And you can also, if you are a biographer yourself, or somebody who's wishing to write about the lives of other people and do deep dives, it's hard to imagine two better models, different models, but better models than these. So thank you very much for coming. And I guess we'll
Thank
see
you,
next
Ethan.
time.
Thank you.